So, my pleasure to introduce to you Patrick, who has a very interesting background. He can tell you about it, but studies currently the experiences of children with neurodevelopmental conditions, and is particularly interested in linking physical activity to mental health. So he does a lot of cool things, but he's going to show you some of the cool things that he does. And Liam, I think, is here today because his story is highlighted in this talk. Is that right? Yes. So Liam and his mom, Susan, are a family in Pond, and you're going to hear a little bit about their story. So Patrick, all yours.
Thank you, Jachyra, for that introduction. And thank you, everyone, for coming back after break. I know it's always hard when you have coffee and treats out in the hall. So I'm going to build a little bit on the last talk, not so much about the biological pieces, but really to try and link the bio and the psycho and the social, right? Because we know autism and neurodevelopmental conditions in general are really linked, right? They're not separate conditions as we used to imagine them to be. But what I'm going to do is then link physical activity and health together and show how they kind of interrelate. So we know generally in the literature from about 30 years of research that physical activity every single day for kids can kind of improve mental health, right? So this would be kind of lower levels of anxiety, depression, and how we do this research, we'll get kids who are generally active, we compare them with other kids who are not as active, and we try and measure what those differences are, right? So we see improvements in mental health, we see impacts in physical health, right? So kind of decreased risks for diabetes, kind of better impacts for your heart, so lower blood pressure rates, and kind of positive impacts on cardiovascular kind of health over time. We've also started to study the impact of physical activity on academic scores in school. So we see that kids who are more active tend to score better kind of in math, reading, writing. And so again, physical activity is just this tool and this area of research that's kind of evolving, and we've realized that it's really tied into life in so many different ways. It's just not physical in nature. From a social standpoint, we also know that kids who are more active have kind of positive peer relationships, right? You have an opportunity to socialize, opportunity to get out and learn new skills, new movement patterns that not only are used in physical activity, but also then translate to other facets of life, right? So if you're active and have kind of fine motor skills, such as paper cutting, or gross motor skills, such as running and jumping, all those other aspects that you learn through activity can translate to other aspects of life. And the number one predictor in youth and children, kids who are active in childhood and youth are more likely to be active in adulthood, right? And we know over time, especially in a day and age where we don't have to run around just to get food, or we have to walk so far because we got the TTC. I mean, kids and individuals who are active over time generally have better health outcomes than those individuals who are not. For kids with neurodevelopmental conditions, just kind of across the whole diagnostic group, we see additional benefits, right? So some kids benefit from having kind of schedules and routines where they know on Monday from this time to this time they're doing this type of activity. And sometimes it's what families and children look forward to, right? They know on Monday I'm going swimming, and this is kind of sometimes what's used as a reward, or sometimes what's also just gives kids a break from daily life. Again, we see big impacts on psychological well-being, and this is generally based in lab-based studies where we see kids do an activity, and then we measure kind of mood over time, and we see big impacts in mental health compared to kids who are not as active across neurodevelopmental conditions. Improvements in attention as well. We think that it's related to kind of more blood going to the brain, and the brain kind of just sharpens its acuity and focus, and again, we measure that over time, and it seems to have a big impact on our kids. For kids specifically with autism spectrum disorder, we see improvements in social communication skills, right? So when we measure things in the clinic, kids who are more active, especially after an intervention of exercise, will have improvements in that domain. Decreases in self-injurious behavior, as we know, which can be a challenge sometimes. Again, in a lab-based setting, we haven't been able to translate this yet successfully to the real world, but in a lab-based setting, we can see that there's decreases in that sort of behavior, and also reductions in kind of stereotypical behavior, right? So things that we would talk about, like hand flapping. Again, exercise seems to be able to delay that kind of onset. Right now, the challenge in this area is we still don't know what the magic number is, right? We don't know what the magic frequency is, how often we should be doing it, how long. But again, this is some early research to suggest that physical activity isn't, again, just physical in nature and only has health benefits, but it has all these additional benefits as well. Some of my work is interested in understanding then how does physical activity relate to kind of the social domains and the behavioral domains of life, which the previous talk was talking about, and motor improvements. And so we see this kind of connection between the three that never used to be talked about. We always used to think them as isolated kind of conditions and variables, but right now what we're seeing is kids who have increased activity are experiencing social improvements, motor improvements, and how are these all interconnected over time is just kind of my broad area of interest. And then you really light onto mental health, again, because to me it's all related, and how do we then tease that apart to try and improve health and well-being. Some more benefits of activity for children with OCD. Again, we see enhancements in mood. This is likely because of the increased oxygen to the brain and around the body. Reductions in compulsions as well, which in a lab-based setting, again, is successful. We haven't had really much success from a research standpoint in bringing this beyond that. Again, you can see a few trends going on, especially the psychological benefits across these neurodevelopmental disorders: attention, mood, focus, and focus on task behavior, right? So again, we've talked about kind of the genetics and how things, even though we use autism as an example, but you can see that things are clustered on the neurodevelopmental umbrella, and in physical activity and health standpoint, we kind of see this relationship as well. One of the most important things, I think at least, is kind of the impact of physical activity on participation and inclusion in society, especially in school-based settings. Some of my research shows that most kids with autism spectrum disorder, at least, don't do much in school from an extracurricular standpoint. Especially from a sports standpoint, participation is very, very low. So some of the benefits is to get kids out there, feel included, and also have a sense of belonging, which, as we know, sometimes can be a challenge for some of our kids. We also kind of are seeing some research saying that quality of life can be enhanced, and that could be not just how people kind of feel about themselves, but also how they see their life as being worthy, or what does that mean to them. And again, it's not perfect, it's not easy, but for kids who are active across this neurodevelopmental umbrella, we see kind of improvements in these areas. So I've told you about all these benefits and how great everything is, but for some of you in the room with children, we probably know that it's not easy to get our kids active, and there's a few different reasons, which we'll talk about in a second. But statistically, we know that kids with neurodevelopmental conditions are much less active than their peers. One study done 2 years ago in the US, about 70% of youth with autism were less likely to be active than their peers. The challenge is that inactivity is kind of happening both school-based and community settings, right? So it's not like there's one or the other happening. It's the challenge is occurring in both settings, and we haven't really done much to address that. We see some kids are a bit active in childhood, but as soon as we get to about 12 to 19 is our biggest drop-off. And after 19, the best data we have right now is to about 30 years old, and as they keep getting older, become even less active, right? So there's a point in time which we're now trying to figure out, okay, if they're active in childhood, what is that drop-off? Why are they inactive? What could we do about it? And that's kind of what I've tried to focus on in the last 5 years of research. What are some of the health impacts related to this talk back to health? We know that individuals who are less active, and this study was done specifically to individuals with autism spectrum disorder, there's a higher prevalence of obesity, which we know then is tied into other health challenges, right, such as high blood pressure, diabetes, cardiovascular disease. And again, we see this kind of impact on mental health again, where kids who are less active have increased chances for experiencing higher rates of anxiety and depression. So again, this is all connected, and I'm not saying that physical activity is kind of the answer to everything, because of course we still need other supports, potentially medication, potentially behavior supports, but this is one tool that we can use that isn't really being used in the community, and that's where my work is trying to kind of move us toward that area. We also know that physical activity can improve self-esteem. Again, we talked about the communication skills piece, academic performance. So it's like, if there's all these great things going on, why aren't our kids active? So from a biological standpoint, across the neurodevelopmental kind of umbrella, we know that most of our kids have gross motor skill delays, right? So this can be running, jumping, throwing, hopping, all these skills that generally would be taken for granted among some kids across this population are sometimes challenges, right? Now, some of these challenges can be remedied through interventions. Some can if they're a degenerative condition over time, right? So if it's low to begin with and it keeps getting worse over time, we can try and slow that down as much as we can. But sometimes the gross motor skill delay in and of itself is enough of a challenge for someone not to be active. We know that there's also kind of sensory components that come with activity, right? So if you think about even kind of being either in an environment where it's too bright or it's too hot or it's too cold or having too much sensory input going on, right? Generally, if we think about sport and physical activity is the same thing, there's a lot going on, there's rules, there's people moving around, there's things sometimes touching you. For some of our kids, this is overwhelming, right? So that's another reason in the literature that we know why kids are inactive. What we haven't really talked about much are the social, behavioral, and the psychological kind of implications of why kids are inactive. And that's kind of where my interest has emerged. And what I've tried to do in my PhD research is to try and take kind of our biological understandings of research, which were talked about Dr. Agnestu earlier this morning and the previous talk, and then link that onto and map it onto the previous talk to then understand how it impacts with the social and psychological pieces, right? So what I'm trying to do is understand the bio, the psycho, and the social and put that together to how that impacts activity. One other thing that we haven't really done a good job of is to directly include children and youth in research. We use them in the PON studies, and I think we've been really pioneers in leading that area. But at the same time, we also haven't had the chance to give them the opportunity to directly create their own data, right? Because if we're talking about a genetic study, we can't have them running those tests, right? It's a whole different area. So what I've tried to do is find new methods outside of general kind of scientific approaches to then engage our participants directly. And we've done that kind of through the PON study. So over 5 years, we conducted 5 studies to try and understand, again, why are kids with neurodevelopmental conditions inactive, and my work specifically focused on autism spectrum disorder. We'll talk about the first 2 points today, the interviews and the digital stories, but we also did a province-wide survey to understand, are kids active, who are they active with, what are they doing, what are they not doing, and you could probably not be surprised based on what presented earlier. Our study was the first in the province to show that kids generally are inactive, they don't do much in school in terms of activity, and even in the community. So again, after that survey, we tried to figure out, okay, well, what is something we can do to understand why they're inactive? So we interviewed another group of parents, 10 parents, to understand from a parent standpoint what is going on. As you know, for the parents in the room, your lives are complex, right? There's a million things going on. Sometimes activity is not a priority, and we get that. But working with parents gave us kind of that preliminary understanding of what can we do to enhance activity. I then worked with youth themselves with autism spectrum disorder to create a digital story, and I'll show one in a second. And my general kind of question to them was, what does physical activity mean to you? How do you imagine that? What does that kind of look like in your daily life? And through those stories were analyzed and mapped onto the interviews that I conducted with 10 more participants to then really try and understand what a daily life in one of these youth really looks like. Because as we know, it's one thing to do research on participants, different to really understand someone's complex lives on what that looks like in daily life. So the interviews were then kind of used complementarily with the stories to understand what is going on. And then as a final tool, we interviewed some physiotherapists to then understand how can we mobilize some of the implications that I'll present at the end into the community. And we tried to work with physiotherapists to understand what might be some of the challenges, but also what would be the practical applications. But again, today we're going to focus on the first two. So you can see that enhancing activity isn't something that's simple and we can just do it overnight. It really is a holistic challenge, but I don't think it's something we can't do. So in a moment, I'm going to show you our friend Liam. This is Liam when he was at the United Nations, dressed really well, might I add. And Liam is, like Jachyra said, and his family is in Pond.
Hi, my name is Liam. I am 13 years old. I walk in my grandma's backyard. It makes me feel happy. I have a blue bike. It is a 3-wheeler touring bike. I do it every week. It makes me feel happy. I ride my bike once a week. Everyone should do exercise like I do. It is a good thing and helps people get fit. When I was walking home from the model shop, I went down some stairs. It was good exercise. I do the stairs in my building. Physical activity is fun and good for me. It is a good thing and helps people get fit. I went for a hike through a park. I want to do it more often. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Liam, for sharing that. So that minute video took about 20 hours of work. True story. That's what it took. So you can see that it was a lot of work, but one way to, I think, engage our youth in research beyond kind of what we've done before is to have them use other means to do so, right? And to understand what their daily lives are about. One of the tools that we've used this research for is to then share their experiences, right? It's one thing to use this for research, but it's another thing to then use this beyond the research environment to then develop an understanding, what is it like to, have autism spectrum disorder? What does it mean to be physically active? And so as a tool, this has been one great way to engage participants, especially stakeholders, when I'm trying to bribe people for some research funding or to understand kind of what our outputs are beyond papers and kind of conferences. This is another tool that we can use. And thanks again, Liam, for sharing your insights into what does activity look like for you. So after we created all these stories, again, about 20 hours of work with all the participants, I then mapped that onto the interviews that they used, right? So we created about 20 interviews in total. And so I tried to then break down what they said in their stories and what was in the interviews, and then to try and find patterns and things that fit, but also understand what didn't fit in their stories. So I kind of broke this down broadly into kind of what are the things that attracted physical activity promotion. And in Liam's story, talking about being happy, 3 times actually he talks about that. And across our participants, even though they did very different types of activities, and some of them did no activity at all, but this idea of being kind of emotionally happy, the pleasures of movement, one of the things that we don't often talk about, I spend a lot of time talking about the health impacts, which is great, but also one way to promote activity, which we don't do, is talk about the emotional pieces. And again, the emotional piece is what drew some of our participants into activity. Another thing that participants talked about was having a break from daily life, where, as we know, sometimes daily life has challenges, especially for our kids. And physical activity was a tool that they use sometimes to just move away from some of these challenges that they experienced. And so Jas kind of talks about what draws him to activity in an interview, where he says, I do the same thing every single day. Being active is the only time I get to feel free. Free from always being told what to do, how to do it, and when to do it. Free from the same routines, getting beaten up, being alone or at school. Going for walks with my dogs gets to my happy place. Being active just allows me to be me, right? So again, we see this connection with the emotional piece, but also the social piece, where for Jas, physical activity was just a break from daily life and allowed him just kind of to recoup, right? We know how intense life can be sometimes. And for a lot of our participants who were active, this is kind of a tool that they used that isn't often talked about or promoted. And while we had participants talk about why they were active, we also looked into why are they potentially inactive. And so one of those complex natures of daily life for families is the prioritization of time, right? So there's only so many hours in a day. Activity oftentimes is on a list, if it is, and sometimes it can't get there because there's other things that need to be done, such as attending therapy. And so for our families in the study, we noticed that therapy was valued more than activity was. And that's not a bad thing necessarily. I'm not demonizing families. But what it shows is that it's a complex phenomenon. And we can't just assume and tell families to be active without understanding the complexity of their daily lives. So Kaz, for example, talks about how sometimes he did active things with his family and was scheduled in his life. But then when the OT came along, that took priority. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but a lot of the research has kind of just said we need to promote more activity, we need to do more, we need to tell families to do more. But again, this quote shows the complexity of that, and we need to acknowledge that as we do research, but also as we try to implement activities in the community. I think one of the hardest parts of doing this research was learning about the bullying experiences. You saw it somewhat in the previous quote from Jas about being a loner, getting bullied in school. And this is probably way more common than you'd expect in general in the community, but also even in physical activity spaces, which generally you would assume that it wouldn't be a problem, but it really is. And it happened in both school and community settings, and it really functioned to kind of push people away from being active. And oftentimes they were bullied both verbally and physically, and usually about kind of limited skill or not understanding where they have to be. And if you can imagine, you can't ask someone to do something that they don't want over time. Eventually you learn to hate it. And that's kind of what Jachyra talks about, right? Where he talked about being in the school change room, being snapped by a towel, for example, having his glasses broken twice in only 6 months from some of the other peers in his class. And I mean, you can't blame a kid who says it's hard to enjoy being active when you learn to hate it, when this is your reality every single day, right? Again, Jachyra's quote talks about some of the hardships that come with it and the challenges. And it's not necessarily that kids are just lazy or inactive, and some of the research has just kind of made that argument. But again, by looking into their daily lives, we see it's much more complex than that. Bullying then was kind of tied into what we've called masking or camouflaging in autism. It's becoming this huge thing. But at the same time, we see that it has other impacts where participants are exhausted from just trying to fit in. And you can imagine being bullied when you're in school-based settings and trying to mask what you're kind of being abnormal about. But for all of us, when we pretend to be someone who we're not, eventually it takes a toll on us, right? And for our participants, we saw the same thing where the prolonged effects sometimes resulted in breakdowns, kind of mental health challenges over time. And again, it highlights the complexity of what it means to be active, right? It's not just a biological phenomenon. There's all these other social and psychological pieces moving at the same time. As you can imagine, because of that, it also can decrease participation, where Michael talks about pretending to be normal drains the life and soul out of him. But pretending to be normal, sometimes he says the only way he feels like he can get by. And by the end of it, you can see he says, by spending so much time being bullied and trying to be normal, it's not worth a few minutes of breaking a sweat, right? If you're going to compare the amount of effort it goes in to be active and the suffering that you'll endure just to be active and get some health benefits, for Michael, he said, well, there's no point, right? And again, we see this emerging challenge of it's not just participants who want to be inactive and are drawn toward screen-based activities. You have all these other factors playing into this whole situation. So I'm going to talk about some implications of the research in a second, and I also included some more practical and applied things as well, based on what was developed through these 5 studies with families. So as I've talked about throughout, it's not just a biological phenomenon, and part of my work, I think, is to try and move our field, both physiotherapists, clinicians, to realize that we need to start working toward a more holistic and integrative approach when promoting activity. Because right now, that hasn't really been the case. We also need way more efforts to support children and families to be active across the whole neurodevelopmental kind of umbrella. As you can imagine, in Toronto, even when I did my research, there's not a whole lot of opportunities in quality programming that's supported or developed toward children who have additional considerations, right? Another one of my findings I didn't talk about in the presentation, but in my research, we talk about families, for example, sometimes were removed from programs because their kids were too needy and they couldn't provide support, right? So instead of attracting kids to programs, some people are pulling them out because they can't be met with their needs, right? So again, to me, we're almost doing the thing, we're taking 2 steps backwards where it doesn't make sense why we're doing this if we're trying to really promote these other benefits that we've talked about. So it's a multi-systems level issue, right? So this is not just the service provider, for example, pulling kids out, but it's at the level of policy, it's the level of education happening in schools and the type of programming that we offer, which sometimes isn't suitable to their needs. And again, as we can see, it's a whole gamut of challenges that we're trying to kind of move forward over time. And that's kind of where my work is trying to focus over time. So those were some more research-based implications and what that looks like, but there's also a few kind of immediate implications that we've developed working with some of the youth and the families and the physiotherapists as well. So I think the biggest message I always have whenever I give a presentation is to get families especially to start thinking about what does it mean to be active. And oftentimes when we think about activity, we think about sport, but that's not the only way we can be active, right? So what I often talk about is, for example, how can we get kids to be more active through, for example, walking or engaging in other forms of activity such as gardening or cultural dances. And I know this doesn't sometimes count, but housework is one way we can get individuals to start. I know it's hard. The laughs in the room say it all. But again, I think if we start pushing our thinking beyond just, for example, forcing our children to be in a program, right? We talked about what some of those challenges might be of getting them into that social space. Some of these other activities, even housework, could be one way we can start to kind of get this movement in motion, right? So it's kind of getting us as adults to start shifting our thinking, well, how can we be creative even about how we can get our kids active? And that's, to me, that's one way. We need to kind of change our assumption that activity is only sport, because it's not. Some more kind of immediate tidbits. I mean, sometimes it seems overwhelming to do it all at once. For those of you who might have ran a marathon or have thought of doing any sort of new activity, you can't expect to just start an activity and be an expert at it right away, right? So it's easy to get overwhelmed and kind of distracted, but what I also often tell families and what we see in the research is if we could start small and promote that engagement through, do something once a week, do something twice a week, and try and build that kind of routine over time, that's way more successful than to just ask a family to enroll their child in a program and then to assume that it's going to have benefits. We also assume sometimes as researchers, even especially in the research side, that activity just has to be kind of this prolonged thing over an hour, because a lot of the research says that if you do an hour of activity, that's your benefit. But what I'm finding, especially for some of our kids with neurodevelopmental conditions, if let's say they do 20 minutes, 15 minutes at a time throughout the day, I mean, that to me is more beneficial in any way than to have them do nothing or to throw them in a program for an hour and assume that they're going to benefit, right? So one way to get them potentially to be active, to try and reap those health benefits, is again to break that down throughout the day. Even if that just means coming home and doing a small sort of walk or any sort of activity right after school and then maybe something before bed, whatever works into your schedule. I think that's one other way we can do it, rather than assuming that we have to get them out of the house. As we sometimes know, it takes a lot of energy and fighting to get our kids out of the house. But that's another way we can do it, by breaking it into bits. We often forget is kind of what are the small accomplishments, right? So if they do something one day a week, twice a week, doing something at all, I mean, that's another way we can start rewarding and thinking about how do we motivate behavior, by celebrating the small steps before we make those big steps. And as Liam talked about in his digital story, to promote the enjoyment and the emotional aspects, which we haven't really done much as researchers and as clinicians from the research standpoint, but that's one way we can do that as kind of everyone involved in this whole situation. Other implications for families, I mean, this isn't for everyone necessarily, but some families might use it as a time for family bonding, an opportunity to do something different. And we know from the research, families who are active in general as a unit have children who are more active over time as well. So one way to do that, I know it's hard, I'm not saying that you all have to do it, but stepping in that direction as well is one way we can go about that. Other kind of strategies that we've developed, especially with kids, is starting with more preferred activities, right? So if Liam, for example, likes riding his bike, but there's something else we want to try, or the child wants to try, and it might be, for example, scary, we'd start with having them ride the bike first, and then transition toward doing something different, right? So that we can get them to feel success, try something different, even if it results in a challenge. But if we don't try, we don't know what the outcome might be, right? And it sounds easy again for me to say that, but at the same time, we have to kind of provide a vehicle on how to get there. What I found very helpful in Myers, I've developed a program for adults and youth in Toronto, and it's a recreation program. And one thing that we've done is when we try something new, I often show a video of what that looks like, and just to provide an idea and introduce what they might be doing. And that's just another visual tool that can help to kind of break down that anxiety that might develop when starting a new activity. Other things, developing a list of what might happen. So I put something together such as come to beach, put on wetsuit, say hi to coach, walk with coach, listen to coach, get in water, have fun. Even something as simple as that can be used as a tool to then try and engage our children. This I found is one of the most important instructional tools in terms of breaking down information and chunking into 3. Even that last example about going to the beach, that's too many at once. A child probably will forget that really quick. I found 3 is kind of the optimal kind of number that we can use to promote engagement and activity. So an example that I talked about for hockey or for skating is kind of give hands to coach to step onto the ice, then step onto the ice and put hands out like an airplane to help balance, right? So these verbal cues that I've noticed are effective for kids, even if they repeat them. Again, a small tidbit rather than just throwing them into there and assuming that they can do it. I think the most important thing, which is really hard, is to try again, even though sometimes activity might be met with failure, challenges. I mean, the only way that we can figure out what our children like is by doing different things. And again, that doesn't mean we have to put them into challenging situations right away, but if we can try and be creative, determine what their motivations are, adapting games such as tag to kind of superhero tag or even Angry Birds tag, again, trying to be creative around other methods that can get them to be interested. Visual schedules, as you can see in the photo, are kind of another tool that we can kind of get our children kind of engaged and having an idea of what would happen throughout the day. Again, small tools that to us might not seem important, but for some of the families that I've worked with for the span of 10 years, these tools have been really helpful. I think the most important thing that we forget, especially when we start to focus on health, is to have fun, and that oftentimes gets overshadowed. But adapting games, even for example, is a huge thing. So the fellow on the left is playing kind of baseball, but using a massive chicken to help figure out that hand-eye coordination, right? To hit a small ball on a T-ball stand can be really hard, but adapting that, in that way, he's doing the exact same motion. At some point, our goal will be to remove the chicken and have a ball there. But again, to start with something like that, to have that experience of success, to be able to then understand what that movement looks like, sets our children up for success rather than just kind of putting them right into the thick of things, and then if they fail, it's really hard to get them out of that. And even Frisbee, I mean, the fellow is throwing it into a big hoop rather than a small hoop. Again, something small that can go a long way to get our kids more motivated and active. I most importantly want to thank the Pond Network for giving me the opportunity to work within the Pond Network the last 5 years, and especially the children and families. I think if there's anything I've learned in these 5 years of doing this research is I didn't know anything. I was really naive about what I thought about what this was going to look like. But honestly, without the children and families, it'd be impossible to kind of get to where I am 5 years later. And a massive thank you to Dr. Anagnastu for helping me out throughout this entire journey. Thank you.
Actually got it the first time. Woohoo!
Yes, somebody.
I have an 18-year-old son. He's come to the gym with me regularly for about 2.5 years. And just one thing you don't really dwell a lot on, though, is the social aspect of it is so strong. At one point, our behavioral therapist paired him up with another ASD kid and facilitated the workout. So there's, one's leading in which exercises for a while, they're counting each other down, good job, move on to the next thing. But also for him, the whole routine of writing everything into his book, writing down his sets, his reps, the weight, everything else, but also being dynamic to skip an exercise if that machine wasn't available, which was a meltdown the first time until we realized you can go to a different one or you can skip it, come back to it. The problem came when you came back to it at the end of the workout and it's still busy. That was a whole other issue. But just, you could do it very much, as you say, in the little steps along the way and build on it. I know for him it's a great experience. I always ask him if he wants to go. Sometimes he will ask to go, so it is a preferred activity now.
Mm-hmm. And even a small example is, sometimes it's a meltdown. I mean, we know that there's probably more meltdowns than success in our journeys, right? But again, unless we don't learn to adapt, I mean, we won't try, our children probably won't try, right? And that's a small example even of learning how to be adaptive. And again, just exposure over time, right? It doesn't have to be the gym. If that works, that's fantastic. But just if we can have a leg in that journey, I think that's important. Thank you for sharing that.
Hi. I had one question. In your research, did you come across any free resources for visuals that are focused on sports or sports activities? Because I have been asked that by many coaches and things like that, where they want to help, but they're having trouble expressing a concept and a verbal instruction isn't working and a visual would be great.
Yeah, so, I mean, you've probably noticed navigating this field of life is challenging from a healthcare standpoint. In physical activity, it's even harder. There isn't a whole lot. But one thing that I would always direct parents to and coaches to, it's called the Canucks Autism Network. If you want to Google that. It's run by the Vancouver Canucks, and they kind of fund that whole organization, and they have a ton of resources for coaching, both from parents, but also for coaches and community kind of providers. So they have a whole section for that, and it's all free. So I'd really encourage anyone, if you're interested. It's called Canucks Autism Network.
I just want to say that one of the things I think is really key is to know how to address how to cope with failure in sport. That's something that's alluded to already. I think it's really important in order for it to work well. The other thing I would add is that in terms of the benefits of physical activity, I don't believe it was mentioned on the slides that physical activity can help with bodily functions relating to the gut, relating to bowels. It can make a huge difference. And the education system. What I want to say about the education system is that they often forget, the system, the people within the system, forget that what happens within the classroom in terms of learning can be carried over into sports, whether it has to do with sports clubs or sports teams or whatever. And what the education system needs to realize is that the accommodations that work within the classroom can be transferred and generalized to sports outside of the classroom, whether it is on a team, as I said, or in a sports club. Because that's where the breakdown occurs, is when the accommodations that are particular to that student or child or young man or woman are not being implemented or implemented ineffectively, that breakdowns occur and the motivation is lost, and the desire to be part of things and to belong and feel welcomed is lost as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I can tell you right now, like my former background is a physical education teacher. Initially, that's where I started before I kind of moved on to research. And I mean, even the way we teach physical education in sport now, I mean, we're doing the same thing we did in the 1920s, honestly. And it was all about military preparation through sport and fitness. I mean, our teaching methods haven't changed. It's very much kind of top down. The coach and teacher tells you what to do. And we use sport as a tool to achieve everything, but we know that it doesn't work when we don't have these accommodations in class transferring over into that aspect. So
I noticed that none of your studies seem to involve, or so far yet, don't involve the school system and educators, and that would be an area, if you could get your foot in the door, good luck, but I think that would be very valuable. That would be very valuable information that you could collect.
absolutely, and you're right, didn't include that deliberately for my PhD, because getting in is probably the hardest thing possible to do some research in school settings. But
you.
that absolutely, you're right, it's an area of future research.
Last question.
You mentioned Special Olympics at home, and that's the only successful athlete from London. My son is very physically fit and able to join the high school teams, and I'm not just on school. Because they said, oh, he could be the manager or the water boy. And it's like, my son's an athlete. He's on the team, but they won't let him on the team.
Absolutely, and Special Olympics is a huge chapter across the whole world, really. Thank you for sharing that. I didn't include that, but that definitely is another avenue where families can explore options of what it means to be active and other activities as well.
Western University is now integrating, so it's on Western, it's on the team, it's on Western basketball team. Half people in Special Olympics and half Western students, but just one group of players enjoys that getting better every weekend because this is the actual Western level athletes. And the association
It is, and again, that's another example of when we really integrate the community into the daily lives of our kids. I mean, it can really work wonders. Thank you for that.
one quick comment. We had real success seeing our therapist learn how to write and bring it down. And I think that gives you more detail and
Absolutely.